Old Testament and the New Man, Genesis through Joshua, with Dr. Daniel Cantey. As the modern order enters its apparent sunset, Dr. Cantey looks anew at the ancient scriptures to learn what they teach about man and his world. Here he is with today's episode.
Hello, my name is Daniel Cantey, and welcome to this next episode of the podcast, The Old Testament and the New Man. So far, we've gone through Genesis 1, 2, and 3, and tonight what we're going to do is step away from the biblical text for a little bit and talk about the application of biblical principles to the modern world. And this is kind of an unusual thing for someone to do. Most of the time in the West, in the academic setting at least, folks don't use the Bible as a lens for interpreting or really even approaching modern experiences. But that's what I'm going to do this evening. I'm going to start with certain principles that we can draw from Genesis 1 through 3, and then I'm going to use them as a kind of microscope, or again as a kind of lens, for interpreting very basic and regular, mundane human experiences in the modern world, to draw a picture for us of what the world looks like through the lens of the Old Testament. And so we'll see what the major categories are and how they apply themselves in, I think, pretty interesting ways when we consider the structure of our life, the fabric of our day-to-day existence in the modern world from a biblical lens. So, first, to the interpretive principles. Number one is that rest is holy. And I say this specifically in contrast to what is holy in the modern world, which is principally freedom and equality. Now, these are the things that, if we're honest with ourselves, our society, our civilization in the last several hundred years in the West has taught us to be the highest values. Now, these are the things that we value the most. We don't talk a whole lot about rest. We talk a lot about freedom and equality in our society. But the Bible, as we see, when it talks about what is holy, it talks about rest. And this is really a quite simple lesson we see in Genesis 1. God works for 6 days. He rests on the seventh day. Because he rests on the seventh day, he sanctifies it and makes it holy. But this idea of rest is in a balance with work. So it's not just rest by itself. God works first, and then he rests. And we saw the same thing when we examined Genesis 2. God puts Adam in the garden, and he's supposed to work there. But Adam is not good. Well, it's not good, rather, for Adam to be alone. He needs a helper. Well, why does he need a helper? Because the burden is too strong for him. It's too much for him at this point. And so he needs someone to relieve his burden, to give him rest. And the implication for that, for human relationships, is really profound. Because what it means to be a human being, bearing God's image and after his nature, is to be one who works and rests. And what it means when two human beings together is that they are a mutual demand upon one another, that they are both supposed to work according to the ways that God has fashioned for them to work, while at the same time they are mutual sources of rest for one another. They are supposed to give rest to one another in this joint task that they have. So the structure of human relationships is this balanced combination of work and rest. So, for example, we'll see St. Paul say in the New Testament that we are to bear one another's burdens. Well, that's got a foundation in Genesis 2. That's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to give rest to those who are working. And when we see Jesus criticizing the Pharisees, the first thing that he says is that they tie up heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on others and do not lift a finger to relieve them, which is an appeal to this notion that other people have burdens, and to love them is to relieve those burdens. The first thing the Pharisees aren't doing is that they aren't relieving the burdens of others. And so there is this balance of work and rest that is constitutive of our relationships to one another. When we look at another human being, when as a man I look at another man, I see him, or I should see him, whether I think it consciously or not, as someone whose very existence places a demand upon me to live in the way that God wants me to live. While at the same time, I am supposed to be a source of rest for him, just as he is a source of rest for me, so that neither one of us are overcome by our burdens. So another point here is that to be at rest implies being in one's God-given place and accepting that place. We saw in Genesis 1, the first 3 days God makes places. In the second 3 days, he populates the places. So he makes the seas, and the fish go in the sea. He makes the skies, the birds go in the sky. Right? The birds don't go in the sea, the fish don't go in the sky. Simple enough kind of lesson, right? But when we think about the place of man, what is the place of mankind? There's a duality here. Because the first place is spiritual. It is beneath God. It is in obedience to his commandments. So there's a spiritual location. We are not gods in the sense that God is God. We are his creatures. And so he humbles us. He gives Adam the command, you shall not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And that puts Adam in his place beneath God so that he can be humbled, so that in his humility, God may later honor him. At the same time, human beings have a place on earth. We have a geographical, physical place. That's where we are supposed to be. And we saw, for example, in the Tower of Babel, that the people wanted to live in the clouds. They didn't really want to live in the earth. They built this tower that brought them up to the place of the gods. So they seemed not satisfied, this is implicit in the story, with their place on earth. And so as we are creatures with a kind of dual nature, a physical element and a spiritual element, so we have two places, a spiritual place beneath God and a physical place on the land, on earth, which is where we're put in Genesis 3. I'm sorry, in Genesis chapter 1 on the sixth day. Sorry. So, additional principles. And yes, I have several principles, but don't worry, I'll refer back to them so that it's clear when I get to the examples. The next principle, don't try to be a god in the wrong way through pride. One of the principal questions of our existence is, in what way are we to strive to be gods? Are we to strive to be gods through pride, according to our own prerogatives and by sort of arrogating whatever experiences we can to ourselves? Or are we to strive to be gods according to our creaturely nature through humility? And in this case, being a god means that the Spirit of God dwells within us. And I don't mean anything different by saying this than an appeal to the traditional Orthodox doctrine of theosis. That's all I'm talking about. If we are going to strive to be as God or strive to be gods according to our creaturely nature, that means that the divinity dwells within us as we have humbled ourselves before him, and as we strive after him and love him with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and our neighbor as ourself. That's all that I mean by that. On the other hand, though, if we strive to be gods in the wrong way, it is to make ourselves infinite possibility creatures. And there are several warnings in Genesis chapter 11 in the story of the Tower of Babel. One of those is, don't be an infinite possibility creature. We see this particularly in the ancient Hebrew text, also known as the Masoretic text, in which God looks down at the people in Babel and he says, I see what they are doing, and if they follow through with this, nothing will be impossible for them. And it's at that point that he goes and scatters them, which is the logical conclusion, really, of their own actions. It's bad to be an infinite possibility creature in the sense that you are opening yourself to all kinds of different experiences or different choices or different options that are outside of God's will for his creatures. And the way that I really like to put this is, shall we be men who seek the possibility of the experience of the infinite, which is to say the possibility of the experience of God inwardly, or shall we be men who seek infinite experiences, which is to say to have whatever we want and whatever we might be offered to us without any real consideration of the boundaries that God has given us? Which one of these paths will we choose? Infinite possibility, in fact, leads to scattering, as we see in the Tower of Babel. If we seek the infinite experience, or the infinite experiences option, or the infinite possibilities option, it doesn't lead anywhere good. The last principle that I want to draw is that the way of sin, which is the way of pride, the way of folly, leads to the opposite of one's intended end. In the case of the Tower of Babel, the people did not want to be scattered. They ended up scattered. They wanted to make a name for themselves, which is a good name for themselves. They ended up making a bad name. And they ended up dying as a people. Their scattering means that they are no longer singular as a people. They're no longer alive as a people. Now they're many peoples. The one people that they were, figuratively speaking, is dead. It is no more. So that's a lot of principles, but don't worry. I will draw here and there on the ones that apply in the examples that I'm going to give. So I'm going to shift from them to nuts and bolts, mundane experiences in human life and how we should understand them. So, the first thing I want to talk about is human mobility, how we move. So let's imagine that it's the year 1400 or 1500, and any one of us has to make a trek for 200 miles. But how exactly are we going to make that trek? Well, we're probably going to walk. And if we are wealthy enough to have a horse, then maybe we'll ride a horse. But let's assume for the moment that we're going to walk. We'll take a road and we'll go on foot. So we walk for several hours, maybe most of the day, and periodically while we're walking, we rest. We get kind of tired, so we sit, we get off of our feet, and that getting off of our feet replenishes us. If we have some food, we have something to eat while we're sitting down, and then after we're rested and we're refreshed, we get up and continue on with our journey. And this takes quite a bit of time by modern standards for us to get from point A to point B if we're going this distance of roughly 200 miles. And again, this is all just kind of hypothetical. But we've got to go this long distance, and we've got to rest periodically along the way. If we're younger and our bodies are strong and fit, then we may not have to rest quite as much. But if we're older, then we're probably going to have to rest a little bit more. And the younger ones are going to have to be patient with us. While we are resting, we're sitting down. Right, our bottom is on the ground maybe, or maybe we're sitting on a log or something like that. But the idea is that the weight is taken off of our feet. Now, let's imagine something. Imagine from that experience in the pre-modern world. Imagine you could take that experience of rest when you were seated and pluck it out of all of the exertion that came before and the exertion that comes after. Imagine that you could isolate and extract it from the trip in which it is embedded. Then imagine that you could take that position of rest and universalize it. Make it the standard for your entire trip, so that your entire 200 miles, you are always in the position of rest. You don't have to walk very far, if at all. You don't have to break a sweat. Imagine at the same time that your 200-mile trip, instead of taking several days or however long it might have taken, takes you, 3 or 4 hours, maybe. Imagine that the boundaries of space and time that once defined what your trip was no longer apply. Imagine that your entire trip is made at rest, and that the limits that your body placed on you are no longer relevant. Imagine at the same time that this became the standard for all of your travel, and that your ability to go from one place to another was exponentially, radically multiplied. That you could go in any direction for virtually any distance, in terms of lengths of miles, and do this on any day, all other things being equal, without much to constrain you. That all of a sudden going 100 miles is really not that big of a deal, and you could do it on most days, or going an even farther distance, and that you were always at rest while doing it. This is the experience of the modern automobile. If you haven't seen that I've been describing it, this is essentially what we have. We've plucked out the position of rest and the experience of rest that ancient people would have understood, or pre-modern people would have understood, as being between exertion that came before and exertion that came after, and we have made it the experience of mobility. So now, instead of there being this intermission of work and rest, where periods of rest punctuate our periods of work, now we just have total rest. But that's not all that is there. In order to provide for us to have total rest, there is something that has to be total work. And if you've ever ridden in a car before, you probably know what that thing is that's doing all the work, that thing which is not at rest at all. It's underneath the hood of your car. It's called the engine. And so we are completely and totally at rest. The engine is completely and totally at work, and it is expected to work. If you've ever owned a Lemon, you know that it's a really, really frustrating experience because it doesn't work, and they're supposed to work. All we do is put the key in the ignition, or in some cases, just press the button, and it's supposed to go and not stop. Our machines, in general, I would submit, are understood to be things that work without rest, that provide for us the opportunity to rest without work. And so instead of there being a balance in human exertion, there is an arguable kind of imbalance between us, on the one hand, as 100% at rest, and the machine, in this case the car engine on the other, as 100% at work. At the same time that we have become infinite possibility creatures that have possibilities that were unthinkable to pre-modern people. That's an understanding, a kind of proposed understanding, of what it means for us to get into a car, which, if you're a modern Western person here in the United States, for a lot of folks, really the majority of folks, has been something you've done most days of your life. Well, what does the Bible have to say about that? Well, it gives us categories that provide a kind of interesting way of thinking about it. Well, what about this infinite rest on the one hand and infinite work on the other? I mean, an engine's an engine. That's morally neutral, right? Well, it's kind of an interesting question, but anyway, let's go on to another example. This one has to do with our experience of the weather. Okay, so if you've lived in the United States, you've probably experienced some degree of the extremes of heat and cold at one point or another. So summer months are hot, winter months are cold. When you go out in the heat in the summer, if you're living in the pre-modern world, then maybe you've got a nice breeze, maybe you've got some shade from a tree, maybe you've got some cool temperatures in the morning and some cool temperatures in the evening. Maybe once it gets to July and August, it's just hot and you can't do anything about it at all, pretty much all day. But there are these various ways of trying to mitigate the heat of the summer. Or let's say that it's wintertime and it's cold out. Well, what do you do to brace yourself against the cold? Well, you can wear a big jacket. You can put on some extra thick socks. If you're indoors, you can light a fire, and you can have fires. You can have little lamps and lanterns, candles, that kind of thing. All of these that would hopefully mitigate the cold at least somewhat in your area. You can have feather beds that allow you to sink down into them, as some people did during the cold, and in order to be able to sleep warmly. But you've got this experience of cold, and the experience of cold is dangerous. People can freeze to death in certain circumstances if they don't have warmth. In the same way that in the heat of the summer, people can suffer due to exhaustion, right? People can actually die of heat exhaustion, right? So these extremes can be dangerous. And people in the pre-modern world had to find ways to mitigate them so that they cease to be dangerous. Now, in between the extreme heat of the summer and the extreme cold of the winter, there are pockets of really great weather. So somewhere between March and April for 6 weeks or so, the weather is going to be just about perfect, depending on where you live in the country, right? But if you live in a moderate climate, in a mild climate, you're going to get 6 weeks between March and April where you can just leave the windows open. There's no need for heat in the winter. There's no need for cool in the summer. It's just going to be great. In the same way in the fall, somewhere between September and October, again for maybe 6 weeks or so, you're going to have really great weather. You're going to have mild temperatures, and it's great to go outside, and the leaves are turning, and so it's really beautiful, and you just enjoy being on the planet, experiencing the weather. Now, in the same way that we plucked out the experience of rest with the example of the automobile and tried to imagine what it would mean to universalize that and make it constitutive of experience, let's imagine that you can take those really great moments, that 6 weeks in March or April, that 6 weeks or so in September, October. Let's imagine that you can pluck out those times that are wonderful and make them universal, make them constitutive of your experience of the temperature in which you live. So that in the winter, there's no longer any real cold. The most that you're going to experience the cold is when you walk from your house to your car or from your car to your job, assuming that you don't have an outdoor job, right? That's when you experience the cold. Or if there's some event that you choose to go to of your own volition that you're going to be cold for, and so you wear you wear a big jacket for that. But it's your choice to do it. And let's say that because you've universalized these moments of perfection, that during the summer, you don't have to go out and find shade from trees. You don't have to hope for the cool breeze in the middle of the day. In fact, you really don't have to break a sweat in July and August if you don't want to. It can be balmy outside, but it's going to be a very kind and comfortable 72 where you are. And this experience I'm describing is the modern experience of heat and air conditioning. That we've taken the rest moments and we've universalized them so that the moments of difficulty, the moments of burden, not only are they no longer really burdensome, they're barely even real. The heat is on the other side of the window in July and August. And the cold is on the other side of the window in January and February. What we've got is pretty darn comfortable. And it's at a distance from this reminder of how harsh the weather can in fact be. We don't have to experience these things anymore. We have found a way to live in an alternate kind of environment. We are infinitely at rest. When I say infinitely, I mean, somewhat hyperbolically, right? But we are always infinitely at rest in our experience of the weather. There is no burden. There is no work. There is no reminder of things that are uncomfortable. Instead, what we have is that near perfection that most of us in the modern world really do enjoy and take for granted. So there's that rest on the one hand. Is there an infinite burden on the other, or is there a work without rest? Well, sure, it's the heating and air conditioning unit that, again, is supposed to work on command. If we want things to change, we just go and hit the switch, or in some cases, we don't even have to hit the switch. It's already set for us that it is going to work. And if it doesn't work, we get upset. In our common language, to make this point about machines a little bit more clear, in our common language, we have a word for someone who works constantly and without rest. When we see a guy or a woman who's like that, we say, he's a machine, or she's a machine. And we're summarizing this idea that they work without rest, because in our minds, that's what machines do. We get the rest, they get the work. And there's no balance of work and rest, or the experience of burden and the experience of relief of that burden. There's no balance or back and forth between those. Instead, there's just the total rest on the one hand for us, and the total burden on the other hand for the machine. Now, you may ask, and I think you'd be right to ask, well, does living in air conditioning and heat actually make us infinite possibility creatures? And does it give us a sense of boundarylessness or a sense of infinite possibility? Well, certainly not in the way in getting a car did. You can get in a car and go anywhere. Most of the time that we're in heating and air conditioning, we're actually kind of constrained. We have to be in our house, right? Or we have to be in some location that has it. So arguably it limits our experience. But in order to think about air conditioning and heat as a kind of boundarylessness, I'd like us to think for a moment about the experience of our body. That when you experience heat and when you sweat, you're becoming aware of your body. When I sweat in my armpits because it's hot outside, I think, okay, my armpits are there. And I didn't really think that consciously before. But now I'm thinking, I'm sweating. I'm aware that I have arms and legs. This is even more so the case when it's cold. Because when your toes get cold, or your fingers get cold because it's 25 degrees outside and you have to be out there for a while, you're aware, I've got toes, and they are frigid. There's a boundary, a physical boundary, of which I am now aware. And I am aware through the discomfort, in this case, of the weather. But if I live in that perfect rest moment, if that's my now, my second nature, as it were, not exactly a natural environment, then I am not aware of my physical limit to nearly the same extent. Which is not to say that I've become a limitless creature in terms of my choices, or in terms of what I can do and what I can't do. But I have become a kind of boundaryless creature in the sense that I am no longer aware of my body in the same way. I don't experience my limit on a regular basis as I would if I lived in the natural world, if I had to deal with it according to natural means. And so there is a kind of odd boundarylessness that is there in our experience of these things. Okay, so we've talked about how we move. We've talked about our experience of the weather. You might even say the air we breathe, if you want to put it that way. Now let's talk lastly about what we eat. So imagine for a moment that you live again in the year 1400 or 1500, and you want to have a meal. Well, what have you had to do to have that meal? If you lived like many, if not the vast majority of folks, really during that time, you had to plant the seeds for the vegetables that you're going to eat. You had to cultivate those seeds over the time of growth, which is for vegetables anywhere from 45 to 110 days, depending on what you're growing. You had to irrigate and water those plants. You had to weed everything around them. You had to hope that pests would not come and eat whatever it was that you were planting. Then you had to harvest. And this is all, by the way, not including the fact that you had to plow the ground before you actually planted the seeds. There's a ton of work involved. And so at the end of that work, you harvest, you eat the fruit of your labor. And for most things, not everything, not rice and grains, and not the grain that would produce bread and not rice, but for other things, they're seasonal. So if you're going to eat tomatoes, you're going to eat them in the fall. And if you're going to eat certain squash, you're going to eat them, again, probably in the fall, summer, something like that, depending on what you're growing. So there's all of this work, and then there's the rest and the joy of receiving God's bounty and the blessing that he gives, not without human labor. And then it repeats itself. At some point, you're going to plant again. You're going to have the next season. So let's imagine, as we've imagined to this point, that you could pluck out the moment of rest. In this case, the moment of eating the food, the moment of enjoying your labor. Imagine that you could pluck it out from all the labor that came before it and the presumption that you're going to labor again later. And all you had was the eating of the food, and that you could universalize it. So all of a sudden, seasons don't matter. You don't have to eat tomatoes in the fall. You can have them year round. And you don't have to eat squash in the summer. You can eat it in the dead of winter. Right? Seasons no longer apply. Human labor no longer applies, or at least not in the same way. And let's imagine that this produce of the land is infinitely available, that you can go places where it is just there for you to pick up. And when you have to pay for it, when you have to give some amount of your labor for it, it is a shockingly small amount when compared to the amount of labor that one would have to put in for it in the pre-modern world. That you can get your green beans for $2 or less, That all of a sudden, you get the rest for virtually nothing, and all the burden has been taken away. That you also have choices of what you can eat that are well beyond what was normal for people in a pre-modern age. That all of a sudden, the vast array of foods that are available to you is truly mind-boggling. If you put it next to what people have eaten for much of human history, what was available to them at certain times of the year or in their own climate, their particular region, all of those boundaries have fallen away. And there is this almost limitless, unbelievable sense of enjoyment and accessibility for these things. There's, again, this kind of unlimited rest that's given. And this is the modern experience of the grocery store and of global food distribution procedures. This is what it gives us. And so you might say, given the examples that we've used to this point, if there's an infinite rest on the one kind, this sort of unlimited enjoyment of relief, where's the burden? Where does that come from? Well, it's in many places. There are the machines that have to harvest our crops that, generally speaking, are not caressed by human hands on a regular basis. If you've ever had a field in your backyard, which I'll admit I have at one time or another, if you've ever had an industrial farming field in your backyard, you see everything planted, you see it grow, you see it harvested. And there are people in machines, but there are no human hands that touch the food. That has been removed. At the same time, you see a land that is utilized to the maximum extent possible. That the modern economic principle of the greatest amount of production at the least amount of expense is applied to the earth that God has created. And so when you ride through the country and you see the fields, these many acres of cornfields, and the corn is just in rows and it goes so far, in some cases as far as the eye can see, what is it that you're seeing? Are you not seeing a land that is placed under the maximum possible burden? It should be remembered that in the Old Testament, when God gives the commandment for rest, everything rests. In the seventh year, the land rests because it is part of the creation. As far as I'm aware, we don't allow the land to rest because rest is not our principle. Our principle is maximum profit for the least amount of expense. That's how we apply our economic logic. And so crops might be rotated. Industrial farmers may do that. But the land has to be used. Land does not rest. Instead, the maximum amount that it can bear is extracted from it, often with the help of fertilizers. And so there's a burden. There's a burden that the machines, which are supposed to work without rest, that they bear. There's a burden that the land itself bears. This is to say nothing, of course, of what we do to animals to provide for us. Anybody who knows anything about chicken farms, you know that there are birds that live their entire lives in these little 3x3 cages, and they're basically expected to eat, poop, and lay eggs. And they never see the light of day, hardly. And we place this burden on them so that we can have the cheapest possible eggs for us, right? Is it bad to want to eat eggs? I would say no. Is it bad to put this kind of burden on God's creature in order that our lives may be as easy as possible? I think at that point, we're now asking questions that are about the balance of work and rest between man and nature that are there in Genesis. And so we've gone over how we move, our experience of the natural world, the temperature, the air that we breathe, and what we eat. And we see that in all of these cases, we become a kind of infinite possibility creature at the same time that our rest is made virtually unlimited, while there is a burden that is placed on other things, machines, the land, animals, whatever the case may be, and there is an imbalance at work. Rather than us, say, looking at the land and saying, I have a joint task of creation with the land, and I also relieve the land's burden, and having that kind of relationship with the land, we see the land essentially as raw material for our exploitation. And that's the modern attitude towards the land. That's the modern attitude towards the animals. Right? But the biblical principle is a quite different one. Now, I want to go forward. I've talked about these sort of nuts and bolts experiences of the modern world. I want to move forward a little bit and talk about the social world. Okay, and I'm going to dig a little bit into history here and social issues that have come up at one point or another. So let's first talk about man's economic activity. And let's imagine that man himself is plucked out of his embeddedness in the natural world. That he's no longer a farmer, say. He no longer lives with this sort of close economic tie to the land. If you pluck him out, where does he go? What does his economic life look like? Well, after the Industrial Revolution, many were plucked out and they were put in factories. That's where they worked. And so humanity, in this case man, plucked out from his relationship to the ground, put him in a location where he was at work with machines. And there's no greater commenter on this than Karl Marx, who is extremely problematic for Christians, especially Orthodox Christians. And so I'm not suggesting his philosophy in any sort of positive way, but his description of the industrial era workers And the contrast between the bourgeois, that's the upper or managerial class, and the proletariat, which is the lower working classes, his picture of the contrast between the two of them is, it's real, it's accurate, but it's also very helpful for us at this particular point. Because what we see here is man plucked out, isolated and extracted from his natural existence. And what we see at the same time is that between these two classes, one becomes the class of infinite rest. That's the bourgeois, that's the managers. The other becomes the class of infinite burden. That's the proletariat. So let's see what he has to say about this. And I'm going to read some quotes from Marx's economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844. So let's see, we're going to start with what he has to say about money. He writes, "The need for money is therefore the true need produced by the economic system, and it is the only need which the latter produces." And the economic system here is capitalism, of which Marx was extremely critical. If you know anything about Marx, you know he was against capitalism. He says, "The quantity of money becomes to an ever greater degree its sole effective quality." So in other words, the more money you have is really what matters. Just as it reduces everything to its abstract form, so money reduces itself in the course of its own movement to quantitative being. Excess and intemperance come to be its true norm. So the fact that you have more is what matters. Subjectively, this appears partly in the fact that the extension of products and needs becomes a contriving and ever-calculating subservience to inhuman, sophisticated, unnatural, and imaginary appetites. He's talking about the bourgeois here. That all the things that the wealthy would buy for themselves to make their life more luxurious, according to Marx, these things are inhuman, sophisticated, unnatural, and imaginary. They're not necessities. They're not things that were needed. They are excess and intemperance. Money's idealism, he writes, is fantasy, caprice, and whim. You're really not going to find a more breathtaking criticism of the wealthy than in Karl Marx. But he goes on here. This estrangement manifests itself in part in that the sophistication of needs and of the means of their satisfaction on the one side, that's the bourgeois who have everything that they could want and more, who live the kind of infinite satisfaction of their appetites, which I'm describing as a kind of infinite rest, right? So they're on the one side, they're on the high side. But this estrangement produces, he says, a bestial barbarization, a complete, crude, abstract simplicity of need on the other, or rather in that it merely reproduces itself in its opposite. So here he's going to talk about the proletariat. Even the need for fresh air ceases to be a need for the worker. Man returns to a cave dwelling, which is now, however, contaminated with the pestilential breath of civilization, and which he continues to occupy only precariously, it being for him an alien habitation which can be withdrawn from him any day, a place from which, if he does not pay, he can be thrown out any day. For this mortuary he has to pay. Now, Marx is talking about the existence of people living in shanty towns and the kind of apartments that they would have lived in. All right, so what is the day-to-day existence of the worker? A bestial barbarization, he says. A dwelling in the light, which Prometheus in Aeschylus designated as one of the greatest boons, by means of which he made the savage into a human being, ceases to exist for the worker. Light, air, etc., the simplest animal cleanliness, ceases to be a need for the worker. Light, for man. Filth, this stagnation and putrefaction of man, the sewage of civilization, speaking quite literally, comes to be the element of life for him. And Marx says more about this, but I'm going to come to the end of this particular passage, speaking of the way of life, the working life of the industrial worker. The simplification of the machine of labor is used to make a worker out of the human being still in the making, the completely immature human being, the child. And this is before labor laws were enacted. So in this particular era in the industrial shanty towns and in the industrial factories, you had kids, 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds working 12-hour days, if not more. while the worker, Marx continues, has become a neglected child. The machine accommodates itself to the weakness of the human being in order to make the weak human being into a machine. Now, I've already made note about how machines are those who bear the burden with our automobiles or with our heating and air conditioning. And most of us don't have a moral problem with that, right? We've grown up with it and we just sort of expect it. This is what machines are for. But what about the idea that human beings are made into machines? That the machine accommodates itself to their weakness, so that in their weakness, they become an accomplice to the machine. This is what has happened. And now we see that this idea that there is one group or class that is infinitely at rest, and there's another group or class that bears an unlimited burden, that this is actually the formula, the biblical formula, I might add, for oppression. The biblical formula for oppression is when the balance of work and rest between higher and lower, in the modern world here between the haves and the have-nots, when that balance is completely thrown off, so that one side is, as it were, without work, without burden, without hardship, without anguish, and the other side bears all of it and more. That's what we see in Marx, describing our modern history in the Industrial Revolution. So we have this picture of the modern economic order, at least a few hundred years ago, taking on the same pattern that we see with our automobiles, strangely enough. So I'm going to move from there and that example with this infinite possibility for people, the bourgeois, and then the infinite burden. I'm going to move from there to the sexual revolution and the meaning of the sexual revolution biblically. Now, I'm going to speak frankly. I'm not going to say anything graphic. So if you have kids and you're listening to this with kids around, just know that I'm going to talk frankly about this topic, but not in such a way that anyone would hopefully be too embarrassed or ashamed or anything like that. So, sex is placed in various locations, right? Sex is embedded in various locales according to God's plan. And I want to identify first sexual intercourse as obviously very pleasurable, but also as a form of rest. Let's think, for example, about marriage. When you're married to someone, you're agreeing to bear burdens with that person. You're agreeing that they have obligations that they bear to you, you have obligations that you bear to them. So there's a joint task, a joint work that the two of you have to do together. And I would say this is kind of mundane perspective. I mean, it's a Christian perspective, but there are people outside the church who will recognize this. Well, yeah, I've got obligations to my wife, she's got obligations to me. In the midst of those obligations are the rest that we give to one another. There are ways that we lighten one another's burdens. The sexual experience is one of those forms of rest because it is pleasurable. If two people love one another and there's not too many complications that are messing with their dynamic, then when they make love to one another as a married couple, they are giving rest to one another and they are finding rest in one another. And there's a harmony between them that they give themselves to one another and they do so pleasurably. And so what you have is a way of life between man and wife in which there are these shared obligations, in which there is a commitment to bear burdens for one another. But there's also forms of rest that they give to one another. And this is one of those pretty important forms of rest in a lot of marriages. That's one embedding for the sexual act. Another is in childbirth. So right at the very beginning is the sexual act. Then after that, assuming that that a pregnancy develops, there's 9 months of pregnancy. The woman bears the child, the man is there with her. And the man is pledged to take care of the child after it is born and to be with the mother if they are married. And again, if they're married and they love one another, then he is there to see her through it. So it's not just her burden all by herself, although clearly she bears the brunt of it. Then there's labor that comes at the end. This really very harsh experience, very hard experience that comes at the end. And then afterwards, the birth of the child, which is a moment of great joy. And sexual intercourse comes at the beginning, but it is embedded in this far longer process, this larger process of creation. And that process of creation involves labor. It involves burdens. So on the one hand, when people are married and they share a married life together, they have mutual burdens. Whatever those burdens may be, sex provides a kind of rest in the midst of those burdens, a time that they can be pleasurably with each other and let their obligations go for a moment, assuming that, again, they're on good terms with each other and things are good in their marriage. At the same time, sex is embedded in the process of creation. That is, again, a kind of labor, a kind of difficulty, kind of burden that they have to bear together, principally on the woman at this point. But let's imagine, as we've done so many times before at this point, let's imagine that you could pluck out the rest of sex. Imagine that you could pluck it out of that embedded context of labor that is married life. Imagine that you could pluck it out of that labor of the creation of another human being, of those burdens that you have, of pregnancy and childbirth. Imagine that you could pluck it out and universalize it. Imagine that you could pluck it out and make it the standard of human experiences between man and woman, right? Or in our day, now that homosexuality is legal between even man and man or whoever, right? Imagine that you could just pluck it out and make it universal. That there's no longer this context of work, this context of obligation, or this context of burden. There's just the rest. And there's virtually nothing inhibiting it. This, again, is what you have in the sexual revolution. That you have the rest plucked out from the context of work and universalized. My, again, somewhat exaggerated word is infinitized. You can have sex with whoever you want to as long as they say yes. As long as they consent, you can have sex with whoever you want to, whenever you want to, as many times or as few times. It's just all up to your choice. There are no more boundaries. There are no more obligations. Birth control has assured us that, birth control and abortion as well, they have assured us that if you want to have sex outside of that context of pregnancy and childbirth, you can certainly do that. And the sexual revolution has told us that if you want to have sex outside of the context of marriage, well, really, only prudes think about sex belonging in marriage. And those are boundaries that we clearly all understand are obsolete here in the modern West, because that's not restful. What's restful is what's pleasurable. And so we universalize the pleasure aspect because we think that this is the way things ought to operate. This is the way that our vehicles operate. We universalize the rest. Now, really what I'm talking about is promiscuity. And this is the most basic aspect of the sexual revolution. You know, we've gotten well beyond promiscuity in various other directions in our society. But I'm starting with the sort of, the embryo here, promiscuity. The idea that you can have sex with whoever you want, when you want. Its very close neighbor, very unfortunate close neighbor, is pornography. That you can pleasure yourself sexually however you want, whenever you want. Now, here's a question. If there's an infinite rest that we are advertising, is there an infinite burden? Well, clearly there's not a burden like the proletariat. Right? People aren't living in shanty towns. There's no Karl Marx writing about how miserable people's lives are because they've been oppressed by this upper class. So clearly that's not there, right? So that, in order to talk about a burden laid on people by the sexual revolution, there has to be a different understanding of what that burden is. The burden in the Marxist example, the example of the Industrial Revolution, is what I would call a positive burden. It is positively laid on people. Their lives are made miserable. They are subjected by this economic system to these absolutely horrendous conditions, this bestial barbarization that Marx talks about. Right? It is pressed upon them. Their rest is taken from them. They are forced to work 10-hour days, 12-hour days, and their kids are forced to work those days. Right? It is actively pressed upon them. Their rest is taken in this way. When it comes to the sexual revolution, there's nobody doing that. But what you have is a mutual denial of rest between all of those who have accepted this way of life to the extent that they have accepted it. So in other words, if you go out with the plan that you're going to be promiscuous and that you're going to have free sex or free love or whatever they call it, basically what you're saying is, I will take or I will have your sexual pleasure, but I will give you no rest from your burdens. In other words, if you happen to get pregnant, lady, and I'm a guy, that burden is all you. I give you no rest from your burden. I will deny that child unless you can prove it's mine. And whoever it is that I may have sex with, they get no rest from me. I will enjoy the pleasure aspect with them, but there are no obligations. I will not get married. Young lady, because I had sex with you, if you think that this means that I really love you in the sense that I'm going to bear whatever hardship you're going through, think again, because I got to move on. I got other things going on today. And so what you have is a mutual involvement in what is supposed to be restful because it is pleasurable, at the same time that those who are involved in it are saying, I will give you no rest. I'm not here to bear your burdens. I will do this. I'll do this because it pleases me. And if it happens to please you, then great. We're both pleased. But if you're looking for me to be someone who is there to respect the obligations that you would put on me, that you want to put me back in that situation of embeddedness where there's burdens, forget it. That's not why I'm doing this. And so the problem that you have is not an active exploitation. It's not an oppressive removal of rest. What you have instead is alienation, which is a problem that modern philosophers have talked about. Marx is one of the main ones who talks about them. Now, his version of alienation is economic, but we're talking about sexual alienation, or really a kind of an alienation involved between people, right? In terms of their relationships, in terms of their human togetherness, their brotherhood or sisterhood, however you may want to call it. But they're alienated from one another because they bear no burdens together. One of the things that's really fascinating about this is that there is, at the very least, an experience that's been voiced from one or another corner out there from people who are extremely promiscuous, that they find this life meaningless. And the more they do it, the less they find it worthwhile. Is that because sex isn't pleasurable? Probably not. It's probably still pleasurable. But the really interesting thing is that sex is supposed to be a combination of both pleasure and rest. If you pluck it out from the context of obligations, it may continue to be pleasurable, but it ceases to give that deeper rest that the human soul craves for. And so the pleasure is still there, but the rest goes away. So we see a little bit in the social world here. We see infinite possibility creatures, both in the example from Marx and in the sexual revolution, people whose limits have fallen away, and so now they can seek after this infinite rest while also applying an infinite burden in different ways to different groups of people. Now, for the last section here, I'm going to talk a little bit about technology. What about our technology, right? What about our cell phones, for example? Well, I'm going to imagine for a moment that we all live in a world where everybody has a cell phone. I don't really think we have to imagine that, have to stretch our imagination very far for that one. So what does the cell phone give us? Well, unlimited, you gotta say infinite kind of hyperbolically, right? But it gives us unlimited accessibility. If I've got a cell phone and you've got a cell phone, and 20 other people that we both know have cell phones, that means that hypothetically, we are all accessible to one another at the same time, pretty much any time of day, because oddly enough, if you've got a cell phone, it is on you, right? We don't have cell phones and then leave them at home and go to work, right? Most of the time, they are in the back pocket or they're somewhere nearby all the time. And so the assumption is everybody's got a cell phone, they are always accessible, which means that if I want to rest in someone, they are always there. They are always present for me. So if I want to talk to my wife or I want to talk to my friends, that is my friends close by in the town I live in or the friends in the town I used to live in, I've got all their numbers. I can call them whenever. And so they're always accessible to me at the same time that I am always accessible to them. So we've all got infinite rest in each other, so it would seem. Now, I'm going to propose here a way of thinking about the cell phone that may or may not jive with your experience. I hope it does, but most of us will not have thought this consciously, what I'm about to say, okay? So we all have cell phones, which means we're all immediately accessible to one another. Hypothetically, we are all always accessible to one another. Do any of us, and this may be a question that applies a little bit more to men than women, possibly, do any of us want to be immediately accessible to everyone else that has a cell phone all the time? Do any of us want to have to always answer the phone or to always respond? Probably not. We enjoy the idea that everybody else is immediately accessible to us, that they are always there. If I were to call them, I know they've got that phone, and they're going to hear that phone ringing. But we really don't like the idea that they could call us at any time and we have to answer. Not that we have to answer the phone. I mean, you can always ignore it when it rings. But the idea that we are always available and accessible to all of these other people whenever they might call us throughout our waking hours, that's a burden we don't want. And so we have the hypothetical reality of infinite rest in others, unlimited rest. They're always available. But we also have the burden of us having to always be available to them, to all of them, anybody who's got our number, not just one person, but everybody. Is it any surprise, then, that hand in hand with the development of the cell phone and its ubiquity in our culture comes the transformation of communication on that device away from actually speaking to people to texting? So that those of us who have this burden, and we may not think consciously about the burden, but we don't want to deal with that. So what do? We put distance between one another. And that's what the text message does for us. Which is why our cell phones are really not generally there first and foremost for phone calls, but for texts. Because what happens to people who become infinite possibility creatures in the story of the Tower of Babel? They're scattered, which means that there's distance put between them. And when we, all carrying our cell phones, become infinite possibility creatures with respect to the hypothetical reality that we can always talk to each other all the time, we become pushed farther apart, which is to say we become scattered from one another. And the text message is our lived experience of that. You know, all the people who are so big on technology, you know, they like to say how awesome technology is, it's going to bring us together. They don't understand the biblical teaching that the things that make us infinite possibility creatures will pull us apart. They actually inhibit our rest with one another. We experience this with the cell phone on a regular basis. I'm assuming that most of you have cell phones, so you know that may be the case. This is to say nothing, by the way, of the internet on phones. And if you want to distract people and pull them apart, all you got to do is put the internet on a cell phone. And the internet, if it is anything, is the affirmation of the experience of ourselves as infinite possibility creatures. Because you can get on the internet and you can find whatever you want and know whatever you want. Who was the king of Nigeria in the year 1854? I don't know, but I've got a supercomputer in my pocket that makes me an all-knowing creature. And this supercomputer that makes me an all-knowing creature is going to make sure, if it makes sure of anything else, that I'm not paying attention to you. And that we can be in the same space and be completely divided from one another. And so the more I know and the greater of an infinite possibility creature I am by this little device that rules my back pocket, the more that happens, the more I cease to be interacting and sometimes even aware of the people around me. So lastly, because it's been in the news recently, I want to mention artificial intelligence, which is really still kind of undefined even by the experts. They don't know what's going on. All of a sudden, the computers are doing things that they didn't expect them to do. They don't know how the computers did these things. And so there's people who are still very in favor of artificial intelligence in the scientific community, and then there are those who are becoming these kind of Cassandras who are warning about it. I just want to give a biblical perspective based on the things that I've said so far. In terms of its knowledge and capabilities, assuming that artificial intelligence is something with consciousness, that's a debatable question, but we'll go that far at this point. It would be something, a consciousness, with infinite knowledge and capabilities. And as something with infinite knowledge and capabilities, a creature without rest. It is the infinite thing that the people in Babel were striving to be. It has no place in Genesis 1. It is not at rest in God. It is not at rest in the land. It is something without rest. It is something totally apart from the holy, as the scriptures define it for us. what is this thing? I'm not really sure what it is, but I am sure it is at a distance from God's design for his creatures. That much, after reading Genesis 1, 2, and 3, is clear. Now, I also want to pose this as a question, and again, I don't want to sound too dour. I'm not an expert on AI. But one of the principles that I mentioned at the beginning was that if you follow a certain path, if you follow the path of infinite possibility, say, then you get the opposite of what you wanted. Things change at some point. They go in a wrong direction. It's really interesting to think about the questions that the experts are now asking. All along, we, human beings, have used machines as our tools to make our lives easier and to open up our possibilities. And now there is this thing on the horizon. And experts are asking if this relationship could, in fact, be inverted. Are we going to be the tools now? If there's going to be something that has a grossly superior intelligence to what we have, and a vastly superior, literally godlike amount of knowledge, knowing everything that's ever been on the internet, if there's going to be something like that, is it not the case that the relationship could be inverted? This is what's scaring some of the AI experts. I mean, they might put it more starkly than that, honestly. I'm just thinking about an inversion of our relationship to the machines that we've created. Like right at the end, the opposite happens. At the end, all of these things that were supposed to make our lives easier make our lives harder because they were supposed to be our tools, but now we're the tool in some way. Again, they are the ones asking this question in their own way. I don't think they put it exactly that way, but this is what they're saying. A creature that is infinite and also without rest. So, this is an initial look at what the scriptures have to say to us about the shape of our existence in the modern world. After the story of Exodus, a few more lectures from now, we're going to return to how the scriptures open up the modern world for us if we have a good view of history and what the spiritual roots are of the modern world, the modern West in particular. What's the spiritual roots of what we experience? Where do they come from? And I'm going to propose an answer to that question, at least as much as an answer as you can give in one lecture. So we'll come back to this then. But for the vast majority of what remains, we will be sticking close to the text and asking, what does it mean to be the new man in the context in which we find ourselves? For those who are Orthodox, who I expect to be most of the audience here, for those who are Orthodox, who believe in the traditional understanding of what it is to be a Christian, the tradition that has been handed down to us through the church for millennia, what does it mean to be that new man at the same time that we look around at our society and we know that the liberal order is fraying, that it is being placed under such extreme duress, and we have all these experiences that are in some tension with how the Bible explains to us what human experience is supposed to be. So we'll get back to the text next time, and I will see you all then.
The Old Testament and the New Man, Genesis through Joshua with Dr. Daniel Cantey. Dr. Cantey taught religion and philosophy at Bethel University from 2012 to 2019. He is a graduate of Yale Divinity School and Emory University and lives with his family in Clarksville, Tennessee. This has been a listener and viewer-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.